Hey guys, welcome back to the channel. Well, as you guys can see here, I've got the 16890A by HBX here in front of me. And as I reviewed this a few weeks ago, I had a crash and I busted the front left shock. So decided I'd go out and try to replace that, as I mentioned in the video, because I obviously want to get this thing back to running condition again. And as I was looking for shocks, I ran across this aluminum upgrade kit on eBay for this vehicle. It's actually for any of the 1/16 scale, since they're basically the same. The 16889 that I have up here is essentially the same thing. And as I was looking at over, I thought this would be a pretty cool upgrade to do. And funny thing is the day that I ordered that, Dan over at Van City RC, really great channel, good guy. I'll put a link up here to his channel in a moment. I'll let you guys know that he did a video that day with the upgrade kit for the 1/18 scale, the slightly smaller versions of these. So it was funny that he did a video that day, but he kind of goes step by step and explains exactly how to do all the upgrades. I'm not going to do that in this video. I'm just going to tell you what's in my kit, and then I'll show you like a before and after once I get all this installed along with the shocks, which I'll discuss in a moment. But yeah, he did a really excellent video that Dan did and explain how to put all those parts on to the 1/18 scale. Thing is, his kit was official HBX hop-up parts. This one appears to be a knockoff, which is pretty common for eBay. So this one doesn't have the exact same parts. His has instructions and thread lock. Mine doesn't have any of that. So it's just not an official kit from HBX. But I've got A-arms with mine. He doesn't. He's got tie rods, turnbuckles. Mine doesn't. So it's a different kit, but there's a lot of similarities. So some of the tricks he mentions on getting things apart would certainly pertain to this as well. So I'll put a link up here to that video from Dan if you guys want to check that out, which you definitely should. So the parts that I got on mine, you get some of the, I'll just put them grouped together here. You get the A-arms for the front, so top and bottom. And then you get just the rear bottom A-arm. Oddly enough, the rear, I have to go around this way, the rear support here, they didn't give you this. And it's just a single piece. I don't know why they wouldn't include that. So you're going to end up with all this aluminum and this plastic piece still attached to it. So it's an odd decision. But again, this is like a knockoff, and everything is included in a bag. I double checked it. They didn't forget to ship me anything. It just was something that I didn't realize when I ordered it. They didn't include the aluminum parts for this. And then you also get the hubs here for the front and the rear in aluminum. So you just have to pop your ball bearings out and place them into these. And that'll be a nice upgrade as well. Nice strong upgrade. You get all the screws and parts necessary, at least hopefully, because I haven't done this yet, to do all this. But again, you don't get these. And then one other thing you get is they give you some of the steering mechanism here. You don't get everything. You just get part of the steering here. So it's not everything. You don't get like the steering link here and this bracket that goes over that holds the servo into place. All that comes with the HBX version. And then again, I said the tie rods and turnbuckles are all not included. They're still gonna have to remain plastic unless you buy those separately. With our HBX kit, at least on the 1/18 scale, does include all that. And that's usually a weak spot on these cars. The turnbuckles are something that breaks pretty easily. So unfortunately, they don't include that with it. So I'm not gonna mess with the steering right now unless I feel like I need to at some point, because it's not the entire steering mechanism. So it sort of like seems pointless to me. I feel like if you're gonna upgrade the steering mechanism, you should be doing all of it, is what I think. So I'm not gonna mess with that. So that takes care of the aluminum parts that I got here. As you guys can see, I also have these shocks I picked up. These were dirt cheap on Amazon, $14 for the complete set. I knew they may not be great. I like the purple look. I like these are aluminum. Now these do have plastic on the top and bottom where it mounts to the shock towers, just like the HBX. So these could absolutely break off just like those. So ideally you'd want to get a full bodied aluminum shock that has no plastic pieces. That way it'd be extremely unlikely you're gonna bust the aluminum. But I did pick these up because of the price. Now they don't have any oil in them. You do need to add the oil to them. But I really thought they looked pretty cool. But as I added the oil to them and I installed one just sort of to see how it feels, I noticed they started leaking oil, and leaking oil really bad. Not really surprising considering this is $14, so it's not like I can necessarily complain. Sort of say you get what you pay for. On these shocks, there's so many on eBay and Amazon, these knockoff, unknown brand by different sellers from China, and many of them are the same, and just with different various names and store names, but you just never know. Some are going to be really good, some are not. So what I sort of brainstormed, what can I do? I really want to use these. I like the purple look of them. As you can see, I got the white springs on these because they included regular stainless steel colored, springs here are rather stiff, and I thought the softer white shocks might be a little better. We'll have to see. They're just a little bit softer, and I like the look of the white on them as well, kind of a nice mix with the purple. So I'm going to try these out. If they don't, you can adjust the tension, of course. If it comes out that these are too soft, then I'll go back to the included shocks, because these don't have. I don't know if I've got any of the HBX shocks here. They're both apart, and I got the two here on the rear still I have to take off. Got the two off the front taken off. These have less travel than the HBX shocks, so keep that in mind, because when I did crash the truck and it fell from about 8-9 feet up, the shock was compressed all the way. So that would be a problem on these with a shorter travel than on these the original ones. But I got to thinking, the HBX shocks, they don't come with enough oil in them. I should have topped them off. They come maybe half full or so. Not ideal. But as I started brainstorming, I thought, what can I do to try to fix these purple shocks? 'Cause I think they're pretty decent shocks if they wouldn't leak, because they seem like they dampen and work quite well, and they're aluminum, they're not plastic. So I started taking apart, the HBX shocks, and I got a whole bunch of the pieces over here in this paper towel. And I took off the bottom, because it's leaking and running out the bottom of these shocks every time you compress the shock. And when I took apart the HBX, there was two white rubber O-ring seals. In between them was a metal washer. Inside of these, you got one black rubber O-ring and a little plastic piece that kind of squishes down. You screw on like the cap, I guess you could call this, and it presses it into place. And it's just not enough in there, and that's why the oil just pours down the bottom. A lot of the Tamiya shocks, when you build those plastic shocks, even their metal ones, they take two of those O-rings in the bottom and screws on, and that always seems to prevent them. They don't ever leak that I've ever seen. So I thought, let's just try to transplant them. So I took the plastic piece and the black O-ring out of the purple shock. I probably could have used the black one as well, because it's the exact same as the white one. Out of the purple, it's a different color. Out of the HBX, I should say, it's just a different color than the white ones. And I took the two white ones in the washer, and I transplanted them into the bottom of the purple shock. It's there's enough room for them in there. Then I screwed it on, and I also put the plastic piece. So I had a rubber O-ring, a washer, another rubber O-ring, and then a plastic piece that comes with this to sort of pushes everything into place. And I screwed it on, and it's a little harder to compress the shock compared to with it not in there. All those pieces, just a normal stock setup. The shock works fine, but the shock doesn't leak oil at all. So I got a couple of these with oil in them. I think it's these two, and a couple I still have to do. But the shock doesn't leak oil now. So all they need to do is they need a better sealing system here in the bottom of this. And I think, I could be a bit premature, we'll have to see, but I think that I've got these fixed by basically taking the parts out of the HBX and putting them into these. Because obviously I want them to all be the same kind of shocks, even though the other three HBX shocks are fine. They just need some oil added to those shocks. So I think I got a fix for it. So at the end we'll have 4 purple shocks, probably we'll stick with the white springs to start out. If it bottoms out too much and it's not absorbing it, jumps well enough, and I tensing up the shocks more, springs more, and it still does it, then I'll go back to the more tense, sturdier springs that are included with these shocks. All right, so that should sort of give you guys an open. I know it was a bit long-winded, but I wanted to describe everything, so I apologize if it was a little bit long. But what I'll do now is just go kind of jump in time. We'll come back and I'll let you see how this all looks finished. If I encountered any problems, I'll let you know. And then we're not going to drive it in this video or nothing, but I'll probably will get it out in the future and let you guys know how it performs. But performance should be fine. It just shouldn't break as easily. is what I'm thinking. So we'll be right back, guys. Let you see how this truck looks after it's all finished. All right, guys, so I got all the upgrades and aluminum parts and the shocks and everything installed on the car. And I think that the aluminum parts, the blue parts, you can see, look pretty darn awesome. They look really, really cool. And I think this is certainly going to be a big upgrade in terms of strength. These parts should not break at all. Now, not that they were necessarily going to before. We have a little more peace of mind and knowing that these aluminum parts are a lot less likely to have any kind of breakage. But for the shocks, I gotta say I'm not real happy. They look cool, that's for sure, but just not real happy with them at all. I needed to get a new set on here so I could replace the broken one. And these were really cheap, so I couldn't, necessarily pass it up to try them out. But they're just really, really hard to compress. And like I said, what I did is what I explained earlier is I added that extra O-ring on the bottom of the shock, and I had a washer in there, and then I put it together, and then that stopped the shock from leaking. But it was very hard to compress the shock, so I did get them better by taking that washer out. So don't put that in there. So basically what I did is I just added another O-ring to the bottom of the shock. And then the little plastic piece that came with the shock, I had those in upside down. They look almost identical. One side, if you put it in, will insert farther than the other. So I put it in the correct way is with the smaller side inserted into it. If you look at this, you know what I'm talking about. But that made the shocks function better. But they're just not perfect. I mean, and a lighter weight oil might help out with that, but part of the problem is just the travel distance on these. Even though the shocks are the right size, like the rear is not bad, but the front's very difficult to compress. Not as bad as it was earlier, and it's not horrible, but whenever you drop the car, I won't do it here on the table to make a disastrous sound on this kind of flimsy table I'm using, but as you drop it, it will tend to just slightly bounce. It should absorb that and not bounce from a few feet above the ground. The 16889 I got back here, this one here, I got these shocks off Banggood. Cheap shocks, I think they're just plastic. And I always thought they seemed kind of like, they're sluggish, I guess you could say. But these are so much better in terms of the way they work, because when I press it, a little bounce is okay. This is like, oh, look at that. So when I drop this car the same distance up, it absorbs it and just sticks. And that's what you want, so a car can stick the landing and go and not bounce. And then when your wheels are off the ground, you have no traction, you're not moving, you're not going. So this is certainly not ideal. So I have to think about it. I don't think oils are going to make a difference. I think it's the design, and maybe these shocks are just not the best for this car, even if these shocks didn't leak. So I may just have to consider picking up some of these ones from Banggood that I mean, people buy these all the time through the video I did on the oil-filled shock upgrade to the 16889, because people just love the cheap price of them, and obviously they work well. I mean, I'd have to check the oil level on these, because I think these did come pre-filled. I believe I did add oil to them, but this just works really well. And these, despite looking really cool, just don't. So yeah, I'm gonna have to think about it. It's not an urgent thing right now. It's not like I'm driving this car competitively, but if I'm over to the skate park jumping with this car, it's going to not handle the landings very well. Even though it's harder to compress the shock, so it will put them under more pressure, but it won't be able to compress them all the way as easily. So it may not bust off as easily, but they're not going to perform like a shock you really want them to. But otherwise, I think this looks cool. The blue looks nice. And we know we've got higher quality components here on this car. Everything went together really, really well. Despite the lack of instructions, it's pretty much self-explanatory. I take the parts look so similar to the original. Just set the original part aside and examine it, so you don't get something upside down or backwards, and you get it together and I go, oh no, I got to take it apart and fix it, which is always a pain in the behind. On these, I think it was on the rear here. Yeah, on the rear of the car, when you're assembling these A-arms and you're putting the aluminum hub onto it, they do give you all the necessary screws and pieces you need. They give you a little pin you slide through there, And you might think, well, that's not going to stay. It's just going to fall out. Well, they give you 4 little bitty machine thread screws in the bag with that. And there's 2 holes. You have the hole you slide the pin into, and right next to it, there's a very small screw hole for these to go on each side. If you screw those in, the large head of the screw partially blocks the hole that the pin goes in, and that keeps it from being able to come out on both ends. So put the pin in, put the screws in next to that, and you'll figure it out. I mean, I've seen other cars use that technique. I know I should have taken pictures, so I apologize for having to draw a mental image for you guys. But I think you'll see what I mean if you would get this kit. Just you put those screws in there, and that holds the pins in place, using the screw hole next to the one that the pin slides into. All right, guys, otherwise, I think we got this video wrapped up. We can see that overall, the aluminum parts is a nice upgrade. If you do need to replace the shocks, maybe just go with the HBX shocks. I've seen them online. You can get the replacement shocks. Then you know that they have the right travel distance for this truck. Just, they probably need some oil added to them. So if you get them and they already have, if they are pre-filled, add some more oil. If you would buy this truck, I would recommend taking out the tops, adding a little oil. You don't need to fill it max, because if you fill them, it's kind of a fine line. You almost get too much oil, and it's hard to move. But you usually want to get close to the top, and these don't have enough oil. But I don't recommend these. In fact, I'm not even going to link these shocks in the video description, because these, despite the great price and the cool look of them, they're not worth it, because they either leak, and if you fix the leaking, then they're too hard to press in. So, but I will link to the eBay listing that I got these for this 1/16 scale, and they also will fit the 16889, and I highly recommend them for around $30. I think this is going to be a good solid upgrade, and I think it would work great with the stock shocks with a little oil added to them. All right, guys, that wraps up the video. If you're new to the channel, please consider subscribing. While you're at it, click that bell. That way you're notified every time I do upload a video. And as always, guys, have a wonderful day.
The power of the dark side.